All righty, we're in Isaiah chapter 53. And this, if you would remember, this is called, it's one of the servant songs. It's called the fourth servant song. But these are considered particularly prophetic of the person of Jesus. Let's begin with a shortened prayer. Father, we praise you. We thank you for the appointment of the bishop in San Diego as a cardinal. We hope it will help to form more and more of the church along the mind of Pope Francis. We thank you in the name of Jesus, our Lord. Amen. Okay, 53:1. He said, "Who would believe what we have heard? To whom has the Lord's power been revealed?" So he's looking at the life of Jesus, that as he sort of understands it in this, what do you want to call it, this inspiration. And it's a curious thing, that you would think about Jesus and know, first of all, that Jesus is God. And knowing he's God, the life thing doesn't make sense. Like, for instance, I don't know if you've ever imagined yourself in the position of Jesus and imagine yourself God. You could change anything in the situations. He could have changed the heart of Pilate, or in my way, he could have just struck him dead. He could have done anything in all these things. And he's saying, who could possibly have heard of this? If you're God, and particularly in their concept of God in the Jewish tradition and in the pagan tradition, a God is not put to death. A God is not opposed. A God is not stopped. God's in charge, period. And Jesus came among us as one who is not in charge, who's at the flow of history that he's a part of, like all of us are. And he says, "To whom has the Lord's power been revealed?" And the idea here is that you don't see political power. You don't see, you certainly see a power over health in Jesus's cures. But you don't see the normal manifestations that you see in power as far as organizing people and all this sort of stuff. That you do not see that visible in Jesus. And yet we know it's there. And then he goes on, he says, "He grew up before the Lord like a sapling, like a root in arid ground." So Jesus, first of all, grew up, as the scriptures will tell us. He advanced in age, grace, and wisdom. So Jesus grew up like one of us, although Jesus was God all along. And I think one of the things to understand about a human being, you are who you are all along, even though you grow up, okay? So you're still you. And the you of you grows and alters, this sort of thing. The same thing with Jesus. But his human personality did that. But he was always this. And he grew up just like anything else. And not only that, he grew up like root in arid ground. And what's he talking about here? He's talking about the contrast between, let's say, King Herod. Where did King Herod grow up? King Herod grew up in the palace of the Roman emperor in Rome. And at that time, one of the things they would do, if you were a king and made a treaty with Rome, you would send your eldest son to Rome, basically to study, but actually to be a prisoner, because then the Roman authorities knew you wouldn't attack, okay? But the Romans would also send an important member of the royal family to you. And that was one of the things the treaties took place. So you'd think if Jesus was God, he would be raised in a royal house somewhere. He would have the advantages of the education. He would have, all this sort of stuff, even though they were, technically prisoners, but it's like being in house arrest in Mar-a-Lago, okay? So they went through this sort of process. But the fact of the matter is that isn't what happened to Jesus. Jesus was raised more like one of the servants of the royal family than he was of the royal family. So he says, he had no beauty, no majesty to attract us, no appearance to win our hearts. One of the things I really like about that is that if you watch paintings of Jesus, they try and make him very appealing. And that becomes more and more evident in, like, say, Italy with the Renaissance paintings, and it becomes very evident in the American church. Like I always tell them, if you're gonna, we have the great saints who became huge, huge saints simply from daily meditating on the image of Christ crucified. And that's John of the Cross, Paul of the Cross, Teresa of the Cross. But I tell people that to do that, you have to meditate on a Spanish cross, not on an American cross. On an American cross, like if you look at in the church here, even though this is ostensibly a Spanish cross, there's been an American influence here. And the figure on the cross looks as though he's showered, shaved, cleaned up, and then stands in front of the cross, much more than crucified. And that's very common in our crosses. But in Italy and everything, they always try and make these physically beautiful Jesuses. And particularly in films, they pick people, I don't know whether they use contacts or whatever, but any movie I've ever seen of Jesus, the eyes are unbelievable. Just amazing the way they deal with the eyes. And the whole thing about here is there was nothing about Jesus to make you pick him out in a group. So like if you had, let's say 100, let's say Jewish boys, you would never pick Jesus out. 100 Jewish men, you'd never pick him out. 100 Jewish carpenters, you'd never pick him out. You would not pick Jesus out. There was nothing about him to attract us, no appearance to win our hearts. He was despised and shunned by the people, a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. Okay? So he was despised and shunned by the people. We see that mainly during the Passion. That is not true in the life of Jesus. In the life of Jesus, we watch a gradual contrast grow. That when Jesus begins to teach, we notice that he is unbelievably popular among, the common people. And he becomes hated and despised by the authorities. And the authorities being the political authorities in the Romans and the religious authority in the Jews. But authorities see him as a threat. But in the others, he was very, very, supported by the people. Although at the end of his life, their fear of the authorities caused them to desert him, the apostles particularly. And he was a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering, and one from whom people avert their gaze. And sometimes in dealing with terrible suffering, people cannot look on it. I thought it was a funny thing. I don't know if you remember this happening, but in a basketball game, probably 2 years ago, one of the really big names in basketball came down very badly on his leg and had a compound fracture. Does anyone here remember that? And the bone was sticking out and the blood was coming out. 5 of his teammates fainted, okay? 2 of them threw up. And you can imagine the reaction all around. It's just we aren't used to looking at that. We just don't. And that's what they're saying with regards to Jesus. He was a man of great suffering and the things he went through, and people could not even look at him because of the suffering. In fact, if you remember, after he is beat and crowned with thorns and things, when Pilate brings him out, what he says to the crowd in Latin is ecce homo, which is behold the man. But ecce means look at, okay, the idea of look at the man. They say behold the man, but it's basically saying look at him, this sort of thing. He says, despised, and we held him of no account. So he was despised by the authorities. And near the end of his life, I don't think he was so much despised by people as deserted by people in the process. But we held him of no account. And it would be interesting. There is a book written years ago by Cahill Gibran, and the title of the book is Jesus of Nazareth. And what Cahill does is fictitiously create a series of interviews with different people. And what he does, he interviews Mary Magdalene, and interviews Simon Peter, interviews the young man who asked Jesus what he needed to do to be perfect, and then, walked around, and interviews Judas. But he interviews these people. It's a really interesting thing. But when you realize that, it'd be very interesting to ask Pilate, on the list of things he did that day, whether he would even remember the trial of Jesus and the things that went on and the people who encountered him and this sort of thing. There's one of the interviews, I really like the book. I think it's very thought-provoking. But one of the interviews is with a wealthy man in Nazareth who made a home. And Jesus did his front door, and his whole thing is that he was such a good carpenter, he should have stuck to carpentry, and not gotten in all this trouble and stuff. The idea that none of the Jews who encountered him knew he was a prophet. None of the Romans who encountered him knew he was ultimately going to be a major force in the community. And nobody did it even occur to them that he might be God. That just was not the issue. So he was held to be of no account. And then he goes on, he says, yet ours were the suffering he bore, and ours were the sorrows he carried. So that what we're doing in Jesus, what we're watching, is the effect of our own sin. And remember, like in the going to the cross, when Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem, he tells them to weep for yourself, not for me. And the idea is it's their sin that brings about what happens. It's not what, and I think one of the stupid things about being a human being is we don't realize the wrong things we do until we see the results. So that, a person will spend a good deal of their time in college drunk driving and doesn't know what it means until they hit a person. Then they know what drunk driving is. But until we see the results, we tend to dismiss things. And the idea is that while I may dismiss in my own life the results of my sin, largely because Jesus protects me from that by forgiveness. He protects me from undergoing the results of my sin, ultimately. But if I want to know the results of my sin, all I have to do is look at the cross. And you remember that famous story in the Exodus, when the Jews are leaving, and they one of the times they revolt against Moses, they have an attack of what are called seraph serpents. And seraph has to do with fire, and that refers to their bite. But they're puff adders, and it's a deadly bite. And a lot of the Jews were dying of it and everything. And Moses asked God, what do I do to stop it? And God told him, form a puff adder out of bronze and raise it up on a pole, and everyone who looks at it will be freed of the results of the bites of the snake. Anyone who looks at it will be delivered from the result. But see, in Catholic tradition, we look back on that, and when we look at the cross of Jesus Christ, we see the effects of our sins, and that can help to reform us from going on in the sinfulness. That it was seen as the prophecy of the cross itself. It said, we thought of him as smitten, struck down by God, and afflicted. And the idea is that in the Jewish tradition, if you're a good person, everything goes good for you. If you're a bad person, everything goes bad for you. Well, things went pretty rotten for Jesus. So as you watch this thing, the temptation is to look on Jesus as he must have been a bad person. There must have been something wrong, you know. We thought of him as smitten, being struck down by God. Yet he was wounded for our rebellions, crushed on account of our evil deeds. Okay? And so again, this idea of what we see happening to Jesus is the effect of my sin. It's just that the effect falls on him, not on me. One of the interesting things, we believe in the Roman Catholic tradition that every sin has a negative result in our world, one way or another. And there is a punishment that follows sin. The tragedy is the punishment does not necessarily follow the sinner. And so like if I get drunk and I'm driving, one of the curious things, having worked in a hospital, drunks almost always survive. It's the person in the other car or the person in the crosswalk or something like that who's killed. But drunks have a remarkable ability to survive these things. And the idea is that evil in our world will claim victims, and it would just be much better if the victim they claimed was the perpetrator, but it just doesn't happen that way. So the punishment that made us whole was upon him. His wounds brought healing to us. And in the beginning of, by the time of Pasteur, they began to see this in a very, very, what do you want to call it, very much along the line of inoculations. I think you know that early inoculations were receiving the blood or the tissue of an animal or human being. I'm thinking of the, what do you call it? Polio was monkey kidneys, but it was receiving the tissue from a person who had overcome the disease. So the antibodies, everything were in there, and then you took that. And so they began to see that about this time when inoculations came in, that was the nature of the Eucharist. That when I went in to receive the Eucharist, I received the body and the blood of the one person who walked away from his tomb. And that inoculated me essentially against death so that we don't die. You know, we live forever. He said, we had all gone astray like sheep, each taking our own way, and the Lord laid upon him the iniquity of us all. So they see in the suffering of this suffering servant that what he takes upon is the suffering. Now, this concept of the suffering servant that will be seen very much in reference to Jesus, the servant serves by taking our difficulties on, okay? And if you were to know much about royal families, if you go back historically, royal families thought they were sacred in some way. And the first person to really violate this was Queen Elizabeth in England. Royalty almost never, ever executed royalty. And when Queen Elizabeth killed Mary, Queen of Scots, the great thing was that she had killed a royal person so that, you know, you could consider killing them. But anyway, they didn't do that initially. But what you would have if you were, let's say I was a prince. If I was a prince, I would have a young boy who was raised with me, my same age, who would be raised with me, and we would be encouraged to become very, very close friends and dependent on one another. And every time I did something wrong, he would be punished. And that I would suffer because seeing my friend punished, okay? But no one would ever punish the prince, okay? And so that's that thing that Jesus became our servant and took the punishment upon us so that we did not have to bear the punishment. He said, afflicted, humbled, he never opened his mouth. Like a lamb, he was led to the slaughterhouse. Like a sheep dumb before its shearers, he never opened his mouth. And this particular approach to the thing is very much honored in what do you call it? In the Passion accounts of most of them. It's very important to John's Passion account that Jesus has a dialogue with Pilate, about what is truth and that sort of stuff. So in John's account, there's a dialogue. But if you notice in several of the others, Pilate will even confront Jesus. He says, I have the ability to free you, and you won't say anything to me? This sort of thing. But Jesus, went about this in silence. And in those accounts where you remember when he's in front of the high priest, doesn't say anything until the high priest says, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus feels compelled to answer then. But other than that, he refuses to speak. He says, forcefully, without justice he was taken, and who gives a single thought to his fate? And this idea of a person being taken without justice and no one gives a thought to their fate, that's a very common thing in society today. Like if the police were to come in here immediately and arrest any one of us, I think we would all presume the police had a reason to arrest the person. And we would presume that reason or whatever would come out or be repudiated in the trial. Okay, that would just be our assumption. It isn't that we need to take care of the person or protect the person or anything. Our assumption is that the police should know what they're doing, and this sort of thing. And in the ancient world, there wasn't anything you could do about something like that. If someone was arrested, they had to be taken to an arrest. And that's one of the big things that plays out, like in that black man that was arrested, and they were holding him down, that the crowd tried to intervene, to stop, you're killing him, this sort of stuff. And the police, that you don't interfere with the arrest. What you do is bring up stuff at the trial, but you don't interfere with the arrest. And so the idea in the old world, you couldn't give a thought to their fate. The government does what they want with the people. You'd find examples like that, of that today in Russia, and you would have seen it in, you see it in China, and you would have seen it in Nazi Germany. But where we have these absolute authoritarian governments, that's not unusual. No one says anything, because as soon as you say it, then you'll be the next one arrested. So that, you try and block it. He was cut off from the land of the living. The sin of his people visited upon him. He was given a grave with the wicked, and his tomb was with the rich, although he had done no violence, and no deceit was on his lips. The thing that's really interesting about this is the way they equate this. He was given a grave with the wicked, okay? Now, who are the wicked? His tomb was with the rich. The wicked are the rich, okay? Although he'd done no violence, the rich do violence. And no deceit was on his lips. The rich use deceit to cover their violence. So they see the rich as being violent, deceitful, and wicked, okay? And the only way you could be rich in that world was to collaborate with the German, collaborate with the Romans. You collaborated with them, then you got to be rich and this sort of thing, and that sort of thing. And so this idea. Now, what happened when Jesus died? He was given a tomb, a very wealthy tomb. Having a big rock tomb was not the norm, but probably the tomb was Joseph of Arimathea's, I think. But anyway, they would be common for the Jews to carve a tomb out of rock right near the entrance to the city, because their hazy notion of life after death, they always like to see their name sort of permanent. You find that watch public television or anything, the huge list of names of people who support that, a lot of them are Jews who've left endowments, and you put your name on a hospital or you put your name on, that's how you're remembered, rather than we believe, living after death. So this idea that he would build a prominent tomb with his name on it. But once the Romans came into the town, the Romans always did their executions at the entrance to a city, because their executions were to warn people coming into the city not to break the law. So the Romans set that up. Now, once they build a place for crucifixion, you don't want to be buried there, because people come through there. They aren't going to stop and look at your tomb and see your name. They want to get through there as quick as possible. So Joseph of Arimathea never used it. In fact, they'll say very clearly in the scriptures, no one was ever buried in it. Okay? And so they buried Jesus in the tomb. Now, they never intended to leave him in that tomb. So on Easter Sunday, the women come to move the body, really. And when they arrive, Jesus has already risen. So that is the only tomb he had. But they were there to move him to another tomb. It said, it was the Lord's good pleasure to crush him. If he gives his life as a sin offering, he will see his descendants and live long. Through him, the Lord's good pleasure will succeed. So God's chosen him. God's chosen him for the benefit of all these other people, namely us. And for their benefit, he will go through the suffering. He will go through the difficulty. He will go through the death. And then none of us will go through permanent death. Jesus is the last person to enter a tomb and see the end of their life that way. That just didn't happen again. Now, how we transfer and transition at the end, no one knows. No one knows anything about it. I always think it's fascinating the way people talk about it. People talk about it with regards to streets of gold and having your own palace and all this sort of thing. And I think it's really strange. I may have mentioned this to you before, but a priest gave a homily the other day, and he was describing different views of heaven and how heaven would be set up and everything. And when we got the sacristy, I said to him, "You've never been in love." He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "If you've ever been in love, you would know that heaven is who you're with, not where you are. You don't really care where you are. You don't really care what you're looking at if you're with someone you love. That's what makes heaven." And that's what we believe. Heaven is actually being with God, Now, if we're a wonderful place, so much the better. But the thing is, we are with God. It is who you're with, not, any of this other stuff. And then through him, the Lord's good pleasure will succeed. Now, you notice that's the future. That's the only future one we've seen through this. They talk about what's going to happen. But they will succeed. What does that mean? That for us, when we look on the passion and death of Jesus, that's all history. We look on the difficulties and the problems and sins in our own lives, that's current events. But when we look at the future, what God intended for us by Jesus' passion will succeed. Ultimately, it will succeed. And that's our salvation. After his anguish, he will see the light and be content. Okay? So after all this suffering, Jesus will, or the figure they speak of, which is Jesus, sees the light and is content. Okay? And I don't know if you're familiar with the people who wrote Evita and wrote Jesus Christ Superstar and Joseph and the Technicolor Coat, that one of the things that is the basic theme that they've used in all, I think maybe it's one person who did all of those, but the basic theme that's used in all of those presentations is a person who goes through great difficulty in their life and at the end of their life is happy with it. Like in Evita, when Evita is dying, she says, I could have lived to give a calmer life and lived much longer, but I chose to burn bright and a short life. And she's basically saying, I realize I'm dying young and everything, but she said it was a great ride. That's what the ride I wanted. You see that with Jesus, all the suffering where it all ends. And you see that with Joseph. He ends up Pharaoh of Egypt. And so all the things they go through. And I think basically it's a promise to us, too, that ultimately, when we stand before God, we're going to be happy with everything that went on in our lives, the good things and the bad. Okay? St. Augustine says that when you come before God for judgment, he'll open a scroll, and you'll not only see all the events of your life, but we'll see the options. So that when this happened to you, it could have been this over here, or it could have been that over there. But this is what happened. And when you see it, how it all works together, you'll be happy with every single thing that happened individually as it goes through your life. Okay? So, by his knowledge, my servant, the righteous one, will justify many by taking their guilt on himself. So he justifies us, number one, by his knowledge. Why does Jesus justify us by his knowledge? Because the knowledge of Jesus is the teaching he gives us on how to live. So he justifies us by telling us how to live. And then he justifies us by taking our guilt on him. It's as though Jesus comes to me and says, Jim, I forgive everything you did in the past, and this is how you're supposed to live in the future. And it's a brand new thing, and that's offered to us every day by God. Okay? Hence, I shall give him a portion with the great, and he shall share the spoil with the mighty, for having exposed himself to death, and for having been counted among the rebellious. And it's basically God saying, he will be rewarded for what he went through and what he did and everything. And we know that according to the scriptures, that Jesus now sits at the right hand of God, on the throne of heaven. And I don't know if I've ever mentioned, if you ever get a chance to visit Istanbul, one of the places you want to go if you can is called Topkapi. Topkapi is the palace of the sultans in Istanbul. But one of the things that's interesting is a sultan's throne. A sultan's throne looks like a crib for a baby, missing one side. So it's a platform maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, and it's got a railing that goes around it. It's usually covered with jewels. One of them has a canopy made entirely out of emeralds, but they're covered with jewels and everything. But there's several pillows in there, and the Sultan would be in there usually with his favorite wife and his eldest son, okay? And I shouldn't say wife, because it was the Sultans in Topkapi never got married. None of them would ever marry. They all had a harem, but they did not want to pick out one or another as being important. So one or another would be important to them at a time, but none of them was ever named queen or sultana or anything. Okay, so anyway, there's thing. I don't know how much you're familiar with the history, but there was a young lady. What they used to do is capture people. They could not. You cannot take as a slave a Muslim in their world. You can't do that. So what they would do is capture women in other parts of the world. But anyway, one of the people they captured was a daughter of an Armenian priest. And she apparently was a beautiful woman. Or they all were. They wouldn't put them in there. So she was taken and put in the harem. And the Sultan would pick one woman each night, spend the night with him and this sort of thing. And if a child was born to that woman, she would never spend another night with the Sultan. Never. And so, it was peculiar. And usually he never spent he never spent a second night with the same woman. He just didn't do that. And so when this woman was first presented to him, she spent the night with him, and then there were some others. And probably about a week later, he spent another night with her. And then probably 4 days after that, he spent another night with her. And then that was the one who stayed with him the rest of his life. even after the birth of her son. And she is the one that was the first one to get the Sultan to marry. The Sultan married her and crowned her Sultana. And she made a lot of changes in the thing. But it's the first time that a woman really influenced the rule in Turkey. And some amazing changes took place. I don't know her name, but if you ever study the history of Topkapi, her name would come up. She did a great number of things. And let's see. And then it says, yet he was bearing the sin of many and interceding for the rebellious. So Jesus was carrying our sin and interceding for us, okay? Now, this is one of the suffering servant psalms, and I think I mentioned this is number 4, but each of the suffering servant psalms appears in this last part of Isaiah, and they're seen as the strongest prophecies of Jesus outside the Psalms. There are certain psalms, like they've pierced my hands and my feet, I can count all my bones and stuff like that, that are really strong prophecies of the crucifixion. But probably the best prophecies of Jesus appear in the suffering servant psalms. Incidentally, one of them, Jesus will quote with is, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has appointed me to bring good news to the... That's part of this, one of the suffering servant psalms. So now, 54. Shout for joy, you barren one, who has borne no children. This barren one who has borne no children is a prophecy concerning Jerusalem itself. Now remember, after the authorities came in and everything, there were not children being born in Jerusalem. They were enslaved and this sort of thing. So there were no children raising up. And so there would be no continuation of the Jewish race. He said, break into cries of joy, you who were never in labor. For the children of the forsaken one outnumber those of the wedded wife, says the Lord. So he says Jerusalem, that is, the city, has been unable to reproduce its citizens and everything because of the invasions, the enslavements, everything. He says, you will end up with more people than the cities who are having, the children born and everything. And what's he referring to? He's referring to the end of the diaspora, that when Jerusalem achieved its freedom after the Babylonian captivity, when they achieved their freedom, pockets of Jews that had fled Jerusalem and stuff over a period of time now began to come back to settle in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem had huge numbers of people. An example of that today, and if you were an Orthodox Jew, this is what you would believe is the fulfillment of that prophecy, is that in the establishment of Israel in 1948, since 1948, there has been a systematic persecution of Jews. And the first place it took place after that was in Poland. And this persecution, these Jews returned to Jerusalem. Another place that took place was Ethiopia, and those Jews returned to Jerusalem. So now, when a persecution of the Jews occurs someplace, they have a homeland to go to, and so they go to Israel. But what you see is that Israel is growing much faster than other countries grow by having children, and it's because we see this return of the diaspora. He said, enlarge the space of your tent, extend the curtains of your home, and do not hold back. So remember, their homes were built, they basically lived in tents. But if you've ever been in a nomadic tent, it's unbelievably elegant. The walls are these Persian carpets. The floors are Persian carpets. The ceilings are Persian carpets, and over it all is set a black tent. And the black tent is made out of goat hair. Goat hair is extremely coarse, so that when you weave it, goat hair is waterproof. That it's just so tight the way it weaves that the water just goes off. So they have these big black tents, but if you go in them, they're divided into rooms, and beautiful rooms, hanging lamps and stuff. They're just, I think they're gorgeous. But he says now, you enlarge the space of your tent, extend the curtains, and do not hold back. And it's almost God saying to Jerusalem, he says, build the place up as much as you can. You will not be able to build it up to hold what I'm sending to you. And I think that's also a description of the way God's grace works in our lives. God says, open up as much as you want, as much as you think you can, and this sort of thing, but you will not be able to encompass my grace. I can always send you more grace. You cannot open so much that you can receive all of my grace. So this idea, he says, don't hold back. He says, lengthen your ropes, drive home the tent pegs, for you will spread out to the right and to the left. Your descendants will dispossess nations and will repopulate deserted towns. Dispossess nations, they'll be so expanding, they're pushing the other nations out, much like Russia's trying to do with Ukraine, to expand into these territories. And the idea behind all of this is that this expansion that's going to take place, it is going to repopulate the deserted towns. In the ancient world, you had a city. A city would be like Jerusalem. All ancient cities were walled, okay? Now, once the walled city was filled, a couple of things could be done. You could expand a wall on the side and build a city there and do that. And that happened 6 times in Jerusalem, where they expanded. In ancient cities, you'll find a lot of them did that. But the other thing to do was to go out and found a little town, okay? But the little town, if there was an army or something coming, you went and hid in the city. And so if an army was coming through, the little towns would all be burned. They'd be gone, okay? But he says, you'll have so many people in Jerusalem, you'll begin to rebuild what we would call suburbs. You begin to rebuild these suburbs and build up again. And he says, do not fear, you will not be shamed. Do not worry, you will not be disgraced. For you will forget the shame of your youth and no longer remember the reproach of your widowhood. So he says, ultimately, when this goes on, it will do away from shame and everything in your background. And I don't know if you have the vision that, like I was presented as a little child of Last Judgment, that we would all be gathered in a huge movie theater, and we'd see the movie of each person's life as they were given their judgment, okay? That's obviously not going to happen. We don't have that much time. But nor popcorn. That's not going to happen. And speaking as a confessor, people aren't that interested anyway. But the fact of the matter is, I think every one of us in heaven will be fully known by people. Everyone will fully know everyone, completely know everyone. And yet, what ultimately happens in your life will mean that you have nothing to be ashamed of. And a good example of that is if you read the Confessions of St. Augustine. St. Augustine describes his colorful sexual life before he went through conversion. And then he describes how he, of all those great leaders at the time, was the one who best understood the love of God. And that's why when you ever see a picture of St. Augustine, you see him holding a flaming heart. He spoke of this powerful, powerful love of God. It's because he had the experience of a very powerful love. And he was able to carry this into... So you could say it was a sin, nothing to be ashamed of, because it gave him this power of God. And we'll discover that with ourselves. There were things that we did that were terribly wrong, but they helped us to adjust our lives and turn to God. That when we stand before God for judgment, we will have nothing to be ashamed of, nothing. And that's one of the things with regards to heaven itself. You will no longer remember the reproach of your widowhood, for your Creator is your husband. The Lord Sabaoth is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called God of all the earth. Okay? So the mythology that they hold is that God is the spouse of Israel. And we also see that in the Catholic Church, where we speak of the Catholic Church as being the bride of Christ. The entity is seen as a female in relationship with God. And he says that by our sins, and by the way we live, then the husband abandons us, leaves us off. But he says, you'll be rescued by the one. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer and is your thing. One of the understandings that I saw of this text at one time has to do with two people you know very well, which are Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton got married, and they had a very powerful relationship leading up to it. But there was a flaw in Richard Burton, which was he was a deep alcoholic. And after a while, she could no longer stand that. So she divorced him, and they were divorced. And I think after that, she was married twice. Wasn't she married 8 times ultimately? But after that, she was married twice. But the next time she married Burton again. And the reason she married Burton again is because he had, in that period of the 2 years, because of his attachment to her, had given up drinking and had reformed. So this idea of this whole thing, that you could see that the whole love thing came back, it was like the original thing as they went in, but like the original thing, he sunk back into alcoholism, and she divorced him again. But you could see momentarily what it was to see this kind of a relationship restored. Okay? He says, for like a wife forsaken and sad at heart, the Lord has called you back. Like the one young wife repudiated, says your God. Okay? So the person is called back. Israel would be brought back to God and will overcome the difficulties or the problems connected with having been abandoned, but abandoned because of what we did ourselves. This is 54:7, and we'll pick it up there next week. We'll see if anyone has any questions.